He stood on the coast of Phoenicia, staring at the impossible. An island fortress that had defied empires for 2,500 years. About half a mile of open sea. Walls of 150 feet rising straight from the waves. And him? A 24-year-old king with an army that couldn't swim. January of 332 BC. Alexander the Great had just conquered half the Persian Empire. City after city had surrendered. But now, on the coast of modern-day Lebanon, an island called Tyre told him a word he had never accepted. No. Tyre was no ordinary city. It was the jewel of Phoenicia, a commercial hub that controlled shipping routes across the entire Mediterranean. Its fleets sailed from Spain to Egypt. Its wealth rivaled empires. And its position? Absolutely impregnable. The island sat about half a mile from shore, far enough to make any assault suicidal. The walls were monstrous, 150 feet of solid stone rising vertically from the water. A 15-story building with nothing but sea beneath it. Tyre knew it was untouchable. It had resisted the brutal Assyrians and faced Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years of siege. 13 years without falling. The king of Babylon simply gave up and left. Because sieging an island made no sense. No roads to blockade, no supply lines to cut. Tyre had ships, it had the sea, and food arriving from across the Mediterranean. It could wait forever. And that was exactly what the Tyrians told Alexander. They said he could move on, conquer Persia, do whatever he wanted. But Tyre would stay where it had always been. In the middle of the sea. Untouchable. Any sensible general would have agreed. Alexander's advisors certainly did. Leave Tyre alone, they said. The city poses no threat on the mainland. You have an empire to conquer. Don't waste months on an island. But Alexander wasn't sensible. He was obsessed. And Tyre had made a fatal mistake. It had told him something was impossible. He called for his engineers. He studied the strait. He measured the distance. He analyzed the currents, the depth of the water, the geology of the seafloor. And that's when he saw it. Most commanders looked at that kilometer of water and saw a barrier. Alexander saw an opportunity. Because the strait wasn't deep. In some places it was only 3 feet. In others, 6 or 7. And there was something else. A natural sandbank. A submerged formation that ran partway from the shore to the island. It wasn't much, but it was a foundation. And Alexander realized something no general before him had ever considered. If the sea was Tyre's defense, then he would simply erase the sea. He wouldn't siege the island. He wouldn't attack it from the sea. He would build a road straight across the ocean, an artificial causeway, about half a mile long, nearly 200 feet wide. Stone, wood, and earth piled from the seafloor to the surface. A military highway that would connect the mainland directly to Tyre's gates. It was an insane idea. It had never been done. No ancient civilization had the engineering to build across open sea. But Alexander had something better than engineering. He had an entire army of soldiers ready to become builders. And he had materials. Because there was another Tyre. Old Tyre, on the mainland. An abandoned city, in ruins, destroyed centuries earlier when the population moved to the island. And those ruins were a gold mine. Wooden beams, stone blocks, rubble. Hundreds of ancient buildings waiting to be dismantled. Alexander ordered it all recycled. A dead city would be resurrected as a siege weapon. Work began in January. Thousands of Macedonian soldiers, transformed into engineers. They started on the natural sandbank, stacking stone upon stone, wood upon wood, creating foundations where there was no soil. The strategy was brutal in its simplicity. First, dump rubble and stones to create a solid base on the sandbank. Then, build sidewalls with wooden beams to contain the material. Then, fill the center with more stone, earth, anything solid. Repeat. Advance. Repeat. Advance. Foot by foot, the structure grew. From the mainland toward open sea. Nearly 200 feet wide enough to move troops, equipment, and siege towers. It wasn't a bridge. It was a military road. Solid, permanent, defying geography itself, and the Tyrians watched from the walls. At first, they thought it was funny. They looked at those Macedonians piling stones in the sea and laughed. An army of fools trying to build land where there was only water. Good luck. But weeks passed, and the structure kept growing. 100 meters from shore, 200, 300. The joke started to seem less funny, because Alexander wasn't joking. He was erasing the sea. He was transforming water into solid earth. He was building the impossible, before the eyes of a city that thought itself invincible. The Tyrians only watched, because they knew something Alexander would soon discover. The farther the structure advanced into the sea, the more vulnerable it became. Exposed, surrounded by water. And Tyre had the answer. Something that would destroy months of work in a single afternoon. While the structure advanced further and further from the coast, Alexander's army was about to face the full fury of Tyre's naval power. What came next would test not only Macedonian engineering, but the very determination of a king who refused to accept defeat. For 3 months, Alexander's army did something no army in history had ever done before. They did not fight. They built, stone by stone, beam by beam. The structure advanced through the sea like a scar of stone growing through the water. 400 meters from the mainland, 500, 600. From the walls of Tyre, the defenders watched. And now they were no longer laughing, because that which seemed impossible was becoming real before their eyes. Alexander was transforming Tyre's greatest ally, the sea, into a highway to its gates. But watching was not all the Tyrians were doing. They were calculating, planning, preparing an answer that would prove the sea still protected the city in a way Alexander had not foreseen. Because the further the structure advanced into the sea, the more vulnerable it became. Surrounded by water on all sides, exposed. And Tyre had the perfect weapon to exploit that vulnerability. Tyre had ships and fire. But Alexander was also planning, because he knew that a road through the ocean would not be enough. He needed something that could match Tyre's walls, something that could transform that road into an assault platform. He ordered the construction of 2 siege towers, not ordinary towers. Towers that would defy everything ancient siege warfare had ever seen. Over 160 feet tall. Structures of wood and metal that rose like 15-story buildings. The tallest ever built in ancient warfare. Possibly the tallest the world would see for the next 1,500 years. The math was simple. Tyre's walls were about 150 feet high. Alexander's towers would be over 160 feet. For the first time in 2,500 years, something would be looking down over Tyre's walls. And in that something would be Macedonian soldiers with ladders, battering rams, and a clear line of sight into the city. The towers were positioned at the tip of the structure, exactly where stone met water, protected by soaked leather to resist fire, equipped with battering rams to break the walls, designed to be pushed through the structure until they touched the very walls of the fortress itself. Alexander was building a floating siege weapon, an assault platform 1 kilometer long that ended in 2 towers that could literally look into Tyre. But there was a problem. A massive problem that the Tyrians understood perfectly. Those towers still hadn't reached the walls. They were at the tip of the structure, yes. But the structure still hadn't reached the island. There were still hundreds of feet of open water. And while construction continued, those towers were perfect targets. Static. Enormous. Impossible to move quickly. The Tyrians had watched the construction for 3 months. They had seen confidence grow among the Macedonians. They had noticed how Alexander's soldiers began to believe that the impossible was within reach. Now it was time to remind them that the sea still belonged to Tyre. On an ordinary construction day, while Macedonian engineers continued pushing stones and beams toward the island, the Tyrian defenders began to move. But not to the walls, to the docks. They prepared an old merchant ship. They filled the hull with pitch, sulfur, oil, dry wood, and resin. They transformed the entire vessel into a floating bomb that didn't need to return. And on an afternoon of favorable wind, they released it. It sailed slowly through the narrow strait. There was no hurry. The structure wasn't going anywhere. The siege towers were pinned at the tip, enormous and immobile, exactly where the Tyrians wanted them. The Macedonian soldiers saw the ship approaching. Some probably thought it strange. A single ship sailing alone toward the structure. But when they realized what was about to happen, it was already too late. The ship collided with the tip of the structure, and then the Tyrians set it on fire. It was not an ordinary fire. It was an explosion. Pitch and sulfur created a wall of flames 100 feet high. The heat was so intense that soldiers hundreds of feet away fell back. And the towers, those marvels of engineering, didn't stand a chance. The soaked leather boiled, charred, and shattered in minutes. When the fire reached the dry wood of the structure, the towers burned like giant torches. In a few hours, months of work were destroyed. The 160-foot towers, those that were going to match Tyre's walls, were reduced to twisted skeletons of melted metal and charred wood. Parts of the structure itself were also damaged. Stones cracked by heat. Wooden beams that supported sections of the road burned to ashes. From the walls of Tyre, the defenders celebrated. Cries of victory echoed across the strait, because that which seemed to be the end of the city had just become proof of Tyrian invincibility. Alexander had attempted the impossible, and the sea, finally, had answered. For the Macedonian army, it was devastating. Not just because of the loss of equipment, but because of what it meant. 3 months of work, countless hours of engineering, 2 of the greatest artifacts of war ever built, all destroyed in an afternoon. Some of Alexander's generals suggested abandoning the siege, sailing around Tyre and continuing the Persian campaign. After all, the city posed no real threat while the Macedonian army controlled the continent. Leaving it isolated and moving forward was the logical choice. But Alexander was not governed by logic. Not when it came to something he had started, and definitely not when the entire world was watching to see if a 24-year-old king would retreat before an island city. He had one word for his generals, and that word changed everything. No, we will not abandon. We will not sail around. We will not leave Tyre standing while we march to conquer the Persian Empire. Because every city, every kingdom, every fortress we encounter afterward will remember that Tyre defeated us, and that will not happen. But Alexander understood something crucial in that moment, something that separated a good commander from a great one. He had learned. The Tyrians had exposed the fatal flaw. The structure was an easy target surrounded by water. As long as Tyre controlled the sea, they could attack at any moment. Alexander needed ships. He needed to dominate the water to protect the stone. There was only one problem. He didn't have a navy. The Macedonian army was a land force, cavalry and heavy infantry, not sailors. But Alexander had just spent the last 2 years conquering cities along the coast of the Persian Empire. Sidon, Byblos, Arados, all Phoenician cities, all with naval fleets, and all now loyal to Alexander after he had freed them from Persian rule. He sent messengers, and within weeks, the ships began to arrive. Galleys from Sidon, ships from Byblos, Arados, and 120 vessels from Cyprus. Greek kings joined the cause. Within weeks, Alexander assembled a fleet of 200 warships. The sea no longer belonged to Tyre. The ships were positioned on both sides of the structure, a floating barrier that protected the construction from any naval attack. Now, if the Tyrians wanted to send another burning ship, they would have to pass through 200 warships first. Construction resumed. Stones continued to be stacked. Wooden beams were positioned. The structure continued its relentless advance toward the island. But this time, protected, defended, with the naval power of the Eastern Mediterranean ensuring that nothing would interrupt progress. And the towers? Alexander ordered them rebuilt. Bigger, better, stronger, with more layers of protection against fire. Because if the Tyrians thought destroying the first towers would stop him, they were about to discover they'd only made him more determined. The months passed. January turned to February. February turned to March. March turned to April. And the structure continued to grow. 700 meters from the continent. 800. 900. The Tyrians attempted more attacks. They sent divers to loosen the foundation stones. The Macedonian fleet responded with nets and underwater guards. They tried nighttime attacks with small boats. Alexander's patrol ships intercepted them before they got close. Each countermeasure was answered with an adaptation. Each attempt to stop the structure only revealed another weakness that Alexander corrected. And then, in July of 332 before Christ, 7 months after he had begun, the impossible became reality. The structure touched the island. About half a mile of solid stone now connected the continent to the fortress that had resisted empires for 2,500 years. The sea had been erased, the water transformed into earth. And at the end of this road of stone, 2 towers over 160 feet high were positioned. Tyre was no longer an island. It was a peninsula, and Alexander was at its gates. From the walls, the defenders looked down, no longer at the sea that protected them, but at a solid road. And at the end of that road, an entire army waiting, towers that surpassed their walls in height, battering rams positioned, ladders ready. For the first time in Tyre's history, the city faced a land siege. Alexander had transformed Tyre's greatest ally, the ocean, into its greatest weakness. Because those walls, 45.8 meters high, so impressive when they rose directly from the water, had never been tested against a proper land assault. They had never faced siege towers. They had never been struck by battering rams operated by thousands of soldiers on solid ground. They had protected Tyre from the sea for millennia. Now, they would have to protect the city from the land. And no one knew if they could. The structure was complete. The towers were positioned. And Alexander, the 24-year-old king whom the world said was attempting the impossible, was about to prove that impossible was just a word people used before someone proved it wrong. The final assault was coming. And what happened in the days that followed would determine not only the fate of Tyre, but the future of an empire that would stretch from Greece to India. Everything depended on a simple question. Walls that had resisted for 2,500 years, could they withstand what was coming next? July 332, BC 7 months later. The road cut through the sea like a stone scar. At the end of it, 2 new towers rose 50 meters high, looking down over Tyre's walls. From the walls, the defenders faced what should not have existed. They mocked it, burned it, and fought against every meter of that road. Now, facing towers taller than their legendary city, they understood the new reality. When a commander is willing to transform geography, no safe defense exists. The towers began to move. Not quickly. Stone and wood creaked while thousands of men pushed those massive structures along the stone road, each foot closer to the walls, each inch bringing those 160-foot platforms closer to Tyre's defenses of 150 feet. The advantage was brutal. Alexander's towers were taller than Tyre's walls. For the first time in the city's history, defenders would be fighting upward while attackers fought downward. The assault began at dawn. From the tops of the siege towers, Macedonian soldiers unleashed a storm of arrows and spears upon the defenders below. From the bases of the towers, giant battering rams began hammering the foundations of the walls. The sound of stone against stone echoed across the strait, each blow a reminder that even the oldest foundations could crack. The Tyrians fought like men who knew they were defending more than stone. They fought for their families behind those walls, for their legends, for the idea that some places were simply unconquerable. Arrows fired from the parapets. Boiling oil poured from the ramparts. Stones fell from the heights onto the battering rams below. But Alexander had transformed the rules. He wasn't fighting a battle at sea. He wasn't trying to scale impassable walls from sea level. He had brought the ground to Tyre, and upon that ground, he had built towers that turned defenders into targets. The first breach opened at noon. A battering ram finally tore through the base of the eastern walls. Stone that had resisted for centuries shattered. Defenders rushed to cover the opening, but the towers were already moving. Ladders descended from the tops of the 160-foot towers. Macedonian soldiers weren't climbing upward toward the defenders. They were descending upon them. The moment the first Macedonian soldier set foot on Tyre's legendary walls, 2,500 years of invincibility ended. The breach became a flood. More Macedonians poured across the walls. More sections gave way beneath the battering rams. The Tyrian naval fleet, which had been the city's most powerful weapon, tried to attack the flanks of the road. But the fleet Alexander had obtained from conquered Persian territories was waiting. The Tyrian ships were crushed between battles at sea and battles on the walls. Alexander had turned every advantage of Tyre against itself. The water that protected them had become solid earth. The walls that had defended them were now lower than the towers of the attackers. The fleet that had controlled the Mediterranean was being sunk in sight of the city itself. The streets of Tyre filled with combat. House by house, corner by corner. The defenders fought until their arms went numb, until their swords broke, until there was no one left to stand beside them. But a city that had never fallen had not planned for what to do when the fall became inevitable. When the sun set in July of 332 before Christ, the proudest city of the Mediterranean was in flames. Between 10 and 15,000 people died, some in battle, some in the retribution that followed. Alexander had not forgotten the 7 months, had not forgotten the burning ships that destroyed his first towers, had not forgotten each man lost building that road across the waves. Tyre had wagered that he would give up, had wagered that the sea would never become earth. The city lost that wager with its existence. The survivors were enslaved. The buildings were burned to their foundations. The legendary fortress was completely destroyed, and through it all, that stone road remained. A kilometer of transformed geography. Permanent testimony that when a 24-year-old commander said the impossible was just a word, he was speaking literally. But here's the part that validates everything. The road, the engineering, the 7 months of turning ocean into solid ground. That road still exists. Go to modern Lebanon today. Visit the city of Tyre. Look for it. You'll find it. Not as an island, as a peninsula. Connected to the coast by exactly that same causeway Alexander built 2,350 years ago. Satellites can still track it. Maps show the exact line where the sea used to be. Historians can stand on the precise spot where Alexander stood in January of 332 BC and look across half a mile of solid earth that didn't exist before that day. Every military strategist since Alexander has studied that siege. Not just because he conquered the unconquerable, but because he did it by changing the rules of the game. He didn't accept that water was an absolute barrier. He didn't accept that some cities were simply unreachable. He looked at half a mile of ocean and saw half a mile of earth waiting to be built. It was the first time in ancient warfare that anyone used an artificial earthen bridge in a siege. The first time anyone transformed environmental defense into a point of attack. The first time anyone proved that when you can't reach your enemy, you don't retreat. You change the geography. Alexander's bigger picture. The conquest of the Persian Empire hinged on Tyre. That island controlled Mediterranean trade routes. It controlled naval power. It controlled whether Alexander could secure his western flank while marching east. 7 months seemed insane. Every advisor said to sail around it. Every general said it wasn't worth the effort. But Alexander understood something that commanders still study today. Impossible isn't a physical barrier. It's a psychological one. And the moment you demonstrate you're willing to literally move oceans, every enemy after that knows you won't stop because of walls, because of mountains, because of rivers, because of anything. The fall of Tyre sent a shock across the ancient world. If the fortress that never fell could fall, then nowhere was safe. If Alexander was willing to spend 7 months building a road through the sea, then no obstacle would stop him. And he didn't stop. From Phoenicia, he marched into Egypt. From Egypt, he swept through Persia. From there, he pushed into India, an empire stretching from Greece to the edges of the known world. All possible because a 24-year-old commander stood on a beach in January 332 BC and refused to accept that some conquests were impossible. For millennia, impossible was the law of that strait. Alexander erased it with stone and engineering. The road is still there, and so is the lesson. When you can't reach your enemy, change the geography. If you want to see how other impossible sieges were won, subscribe. We're dissecting the most ingenious strategies in history. Because the greatest victories don't come from fighting harder. They come from changing the battlefield. Alexander turned the impossible into the inevitable, 1 meter at a time, and that permanent scar across the sea remains there, waiting to remind anyone who doubts. Impossible is just a word people use before someone proves them wrong.